this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how you can say if a psychological condition exists and how your temperament can influence your political ideology.
All right, so how have psychologists studied personality? Well, I'm going to talk most about the statistical psychometric approach to begin with, but there are other approaches that we will talk about as well. So let me give you the background on the self-report methodology first, because it's really formed the backbone of psychological research into personality. So imagine that you took a comprehensive sample of all the descriptive adjectives in the English language. Now, it's trickier than you think, because actually what constitutes an adjective isn't that easy to determine, because many words have forms that are adjective, verb, and noun, depending on how the same word is written out. So distinguishing adjectives from verbs or adverbs turns out to be more difficult than you might think. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you could collect all of the descriptive adjectives in the English language, and that then perhaps you decided, because you don't want to use all of them, you decided that you were going to use the most common 1,000 of them. And there are tables that enable you to look up the frequency of words. And it turns out that in common parlance, it's like 5% of the vocabulary of English language accounts for 95% of the usage. It's an example of this phenomena called the Pareto distribution, which we will talk about later. So, in fact, most discourse is done with 500 words. You can get about 80%, something like that, of speech in terms of single word comprehension with 500 words. So let's say you took you took all the descriptive adjectives, and then you took the ones that were the most common 1,000. And so here's the hypothesis part. And this is a critical thing to know. This is called the linguistic hypothesis. And the linguistic hypothesis is that variation in personality among human beings is of sufficient import so that it's become accurately coded in the lexicon. So what that means is that, roughly speaking, is that over the course of the evolution of any language, we'll use English as the example here, descriptive terms have been generated that actually do cover the variation in personality, and that essentially cover them without bias. Now, that's a hypothesis. Actually, it's an axiom. It's because the hypothesis is, in some sense, it's not exactly testable. We'll leave that aside for now. It's testable a little bit, but not easily. So that's the first thing you have to accept. You have to accept that it's possible to extract out what constitutes personality by looking at the linguistic representation of descriptors insofar as they're encapsulated in language. Okay, so when people talk about trait models like the Big Five being comprehensive representations of personality, that isn't exactly what they mean. And you need to know this. What they mean is that it's a comprehensive representation of personality insofar as personality has been encapsulated in language. There may be elements of personality that we haven't been able to talk about, or we don't know how to talk about, that are of crucial importance. And there may not be, but the Big Five theorists assume that there aren't. All right, so that's a limitation of the theory. But if you accept that, then you say, well, the first thing you want to do is take a relatively random cross-section of the descriptive terms, because then you don't introduce bias into the initial stages of the inquiry. So, Matt, I'll tell you something that we did recently, and you can tell me what you think about it. It's analogous. We were trying to study political correctness. And so the first thing we were trying to figure out was, is there even such a thing? Because if you look at the political dialogue, what you find is that people on the side of the political spectrum who have been defined as politically correct tend to say that it doesn't exist, and that category is just a pejorative term that was invented by people who hold alternative political opinions. And so the first question is, well, what do you mean does it exist? What do you mean by exist? How do you tell if a psychological concept is real? Like, is anger something that exists objectively? Is it an objective phenomena? Well, it's not that easy to determine. You say, well, we act like it is, and we understand what anger means, but no one goes around in the world and says anger, without saying anything else, or you'd run away from them. What they do is they place the word anger into a sentence and place the sentence within a conversation, and they enable you to infer exactly what they mean by the word anger by listening to the surrounding context, right? And if you're going to turn that into something like an objective term, what you do is you pull out the term anger, and then you make the hypothesis that it represents something real in the objective world. But it's not that easy to determine if something does exist, especially if it's a psychological phenomena, in the real world. What do you mean by exist? That's the problem of construct validation, okay? So that's another term you really need to know if you're interested in experimental psychology, especially on the personality end. A construct is a representation of something psychological that hypothetically exists objectively. How do you establish its existence objectively? Well, does fear exist? No, you have the problem with all the emotional terms. Does joy exist? Does surprise exist? Does embarrassment exist? Does guilt exist? Shame? How are they related to one another? Guilt and shame, for example, seem quite similar to one another, right? And pain and fear and anger all seem to share the attribute of unpleasant and negative emotions. And so if something exists, it should be the same as some things and different from other things. And that's part of construct validation as well, to specify how the construct is the same as some things and different from others. Anger should be reliably distinguishable from joy, for example, because otherwise they're not different. And anger and fear should be somewhat the same if they're both negative emotions. And so it's extraordinarily complex to validate a construct. And so here's what we did with political correctness. And the reason I'm using the political examples is because that's an obvious place where self-serving bias can enter the scientific arena, right? So if I wanted to make a point about political correctness, or if I wanted to make a point about right-wing fascism, I could build my biases into the measurement instruments accidentally, and then they would produce as output what I put into them as input. And I want to protect myself against that if I actually want to do the scientific investigation properly. So what we did when we started to construct our measures of political correctness was employ a number of people to go through as many news sources as they could get their hands on to identify any attitude or behavior, roughly that had been described by anyone at all as potentially politically correct. So it was kind of agnostic. And we were trying to do it as randomly as possible, to get as many news sources as we possibly could, so that we were sampling across the environment without bias. Okay, so then we came up with, I don't remember how many, couple hundred, maybe more, couple hundred items that were roughly indicative of what you might describe as political correctness. But that's not good enough, right? Because just because you have this random assemblage of items doesn't indicate at all that they're all measuring something that was similar. Right? That's just implicit. They're all called political correctness, but you don't know if those attitudes co-vary. And what that means is, if you held one attitude of that list, were you more likely to hold another or multiple others, right? So does the conditional probability of holding multiple items, is there a high probability of holding true multiple items simultaneously? Well, you figure that out with factor analysis. So what we did is we turned that into a questionnaire using different question types, and we administered it to several hundred people, and we did a factor analysis, and we found actually that there was such a thing as political correctness because the questions clumped together. People would reliably answer them in a patterned manner, but that there were actually two dimensions that were quite separate. So there isn't one political correctness, there seems to be two. And then we looked at the personality predictors and the IQ predictors and a variety of other predictors that would enable us to come to some understanding of the temperamental proclivity towards those political attitudes, if any. We knew already that political conservatives tended to be low in trait openness, that's the creativity dimension, and high in trait conscientiousness. Whereas political liberals tended to be high in trait openness and low in conscientiousness. And so one of the things that's extraordinarily interesting to know from a Big Five perspective is that your political proclivities are very powerfully influenced by your temperament. And so one of the things you can think about with regards to ongoing political discussions in the real world is that those discussions are actually attempts by people of different temperaments, one, to impose their temperamental viewpoints on the world, and two, to engage in a dialogue with people who are actually quite different than they are.
Thanks for watching.